It was late. The house was asleep, and the 19-year-old Maid was kneeling at the fireplace in the study of one of the most dangerous men in Louisiana, feeding the file into the flames one page at a time. June Merritt was still in her gray uniform, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she worked without any hurry at all, separating each sheet from the clip and letting it drop into the fire in a steady rhythm, the way a woman folds bed linen. She never heard him coming. No one ever heard Rafe Ferraro coming. He stood in the doorway in a white shirt with the sleeves turned back, a glass of water in his left hand, and he looked at the fire and at the stack thinning in the girl's fingers, and then at her. In that house, men had lost their lives over far smaller things than this. "Do you know what you're burning?" His voice was level. It never rose so much as half a note, and that was the part that frightened people. June did not stand up. She let the last page fall into the flames, wiped her hands on her apron, and only then looked up and met his eyes, something no one who worked in that house had ever dared to do. "I do," she said. "It's upstairs, in my notebook. Every page of it." He did not move. "It was in your desk drawer, Mr. Ferraro. That means somebody got into this room. Somebody has a key, and they left it exactly where you were certain to find it, not where a man hides something." Outside the window, a barge sounded its horn on the Mississippi, a long, low note, as old as the city itself. "They didn't put it in here for you to read. They put it in here so that in a few days, when the police come, they'll find it in your house." The glass in Rafe's hand stopped halfway to the table. June. 3 weeks she had scrubbed his floors, cleared his table, washed his shirts, and this was the first time he had spoken her name with anything like quiet attention. Rafe set the glass down on the wood, very gently. "Sit down. Start from the beginning." 3 weeks earlier, that same girl had been standing in the rain behind a laundromat in Baton Rouge, with $11 in her pocket, and a name scrawled on the back of a grocery receipt, and she had believed she was walking straight into the worst thing that could happen to a girl with no one left in the world. She was wrong in both directions. If stories like this one stay with you, leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. The employment office on 3rd Street smelled like carbon paper and old coffee, and Corinne Pelletier kept the folder closed under both hands the entire time she talked, the way a woman holds down a napkin on a windy day. She was somewhere past 50, with reading glasses pushed up into hair she still colored, and a voice that had spent 20 years telling people things they did not want to hear. There was no one else in the room. The door was shut. The blinds were half drawn against the afternoon glare coming off the parked cars. And still she leaned forward and lowered her voice before she said the name. "Ferraro, Prytania Street, Uptown." She let it sit there a moment. "Live-in position. Room and board, plus wages. They pay every 2 weeks, in full, never late." June Merritt sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, because she had learned somewhere along the way that people decided about you in the first few seconds, and posture cost nothing. She was small and thin in the way of somebody who had been careful with food for a long time, and her hair was pulled back with a plain black band. Her shoes were clean. She had cleaned them the night before with a paper towel and water from a gas station sink, and she had done it without any self-pity at all, the way a person oils a hinge. "You know that house?" Corinne asked. "You know whose house that is?" And June, who had grown up in Louisiana, who had heard the name the way everyone in Louisiana heard it, said the only thing there was to say, "Do I have another option, ma'am?" Corinne Pelletier did not answer. She opened the folder and slid the paperwork across the desk and told June the bus left in the morning, and she did not once look up, and that silence was the answer, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The bus went south and east through country that flattened out and turned the color of weak tea, water on both sides of the highway, cypress standing in it with their knees up, gray beards of moss hanging off the branches without moving, because there was no wind, because there is often no wind out there at all, egrets white as paper in the shallows, a dead refrigerator lying in the reeds with somebody's initials sprayed on the door. June sat by the window with a canvas bag on her knees and watched it go by and did not think about what she had left behind, because thinking about it had stopped being useful some time ago. In the bag were 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush, a folded envelope of documents that proved almost nothing about her, and a small brass key that had belonged to her mother and no longer opened anything anywhere in the world. She kept the key in her coat pocket instead, where she could touch it, and she touched it twice on the ride down, and then made herself stop. New Orleans came up out of the flat land the way a ship comes up over the horizon, all at once, and lower than expected. She changed to a streetcar at Canal, and rode it up St. Charles Avenue, with her bag between her feet, past white columns and iron fences, and lawns the size of the entire block she had lived on as a child, and the light came down through the oaks in pieces, and the car rocked and clanged and let people off, and every one of them seemed to know exactly where they were going. She walked the last part. The house on Britannia Street sat behind a black iron fence, with the pickets bent into shapes at the top, and there were 2 oaks in the front yard, older than the fence, and older than the house, and the moss hung off them so still it looked painted on. The house was white and 3 stories, and had a porch that ran the whole width of it. It was too big. That was the only clear thought she had standing there with her bag. It was simply too big for one girl to be walking up to. She rang the bell. The woman who opened the door was near 60, straight-backed, in a pressed apron with not one wrinkle in it, and she had the kind of face that had made its decisions early and rarely revisited them. She looked at June's shoes, then her bag, then her hair, then, finally, her face. "Odette Boudreau," she said. "I run the house." She stepped back exactly enough to let June through and no further. "You're the 7th one this year. The 6 before you didn't last 3 weeks. He came down the back stairs while Odette was still showing her where the linens were kept, and he did not announce himself. And June understood later that this was simply how the man moved through his own house. Rafe Ferraro was somewhere past 30, tall, built like a man who had carried things for a living before he ever sat behind a desk, and he wore a white shirt with the sleeves turned back and no tie, and a watch with a black face. There was a thin scar through his left eyebrow, old and faded. He did not offer his hand. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way a man looks at weather coming in off the Gulf, without expression, taking the measure of it. "Miss Merritt." "Yes, sir. 3 rules in this house." He said it the way another man would read a grocery list, without weight, because weight was not necessary. "You don't talk to anybody about what happens inside these walls. Not reporters, not neighbors, not anybody who buys you a cup of coffee and seems friendly." She nodded. "You don't go into the 3rd floor when the doors are shut, not to clean, not to look for anything. If something needs doing up there, you tell Odette, and she tells me." She nodded again, and then he paused. And it was a real pause, not a performance of one, and she looked up because the rhythm of it had changed. "And if anybody in this house ever makes you feel unsafe," he said, "including me, you say it out loud, to my face. You don't wait, and you don't work around it." June had no idea what to do with that. She had spent 4 years in houses where the rule was the opposite, where the entire arrangement depended on a girl learning not to say things out loud, and now here was a man she had been warned about in a locked office 2 hours north, handing her permission she had never once been offered by anyone who was supposed to be safe. She said thank you, because there was nothing else, and it came out smaller than she wanted. He did not seem to notice, or he did and let it pass. He picked up her bag before she could reach for it, which she had not expected either, and carried it up 2 flights, and then a 3rd, narrower set of stairs to the top of the house. The attic room had a slanted ceiling on one side, and a bed with clean white sheets, and a wool blanket folded at the foot, and a small writing desk under the window, and a chair, and a washstand. The window faced east over the rooftops and the treetops toward the bend in the river, and the water was the color of milky coffee in the last of the light, and a tug was working a string of barges upstream against the current, slow as a minute hand. He set her bag down beside the bed. Then he took something out of his shirt pocket and held it out, and she put her hand out flat without thinking, and he laid a key in her palm. "The bolt works from the inside," he said. "That's the only key. I don't keep a copy." June stood there holding it. It was warm from his pocket. She turned toward the window because her voice had gone somewhere she could not follow it, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Ferraro," to the glass instead of to him, and heard his boots on the narrow stairs going down, and the door pulled shut, and then nothing. In her coat pocket was her mother's brass key. She had carried it since she was 14. It opened the front door of an apartment on a street in Baton Rouge, where the building had been torn down and a parking lot put in, and she had known that for years, and had never once considered throwing it away. She stood in the middle of that small clean room with a key in each hand, one that opened nothing and one that was hers, and she sat down on the edge of the bed and put both palms flat on the blanket and let herself breathe. In the morning, while the sky over the rooftops was still the color of an oyster shell. June came down to start the coffee and found a small person already sitting at the kitchen table in rabbit slippers, feet swinging well above the floor, drawing on the back of a grocery receipt with a green pencil. "That's a barge," the child said, without looking up. "That's the whole tow. There's 9 of them, but I only fit 6. June set the kettle down and looked. It was a good barge. "That's the Algiers ferry," said Poppy Ferraro, moving the pencil along. "That's the crane at the wharf." "Do you know how to draw a crane?" June said she did not. Poppy slid the receipt over and moved her chair and patted the seat beside her with the flat of her hand and said, "It's easy. You start with the leg." The household ledger lived in a drawer in the butler's pantry, and nobody had reorganized it in years. And by the end of her second week, June had done it anyway, because idle hands made her feel like a guest, and she had no intention of being one. It was ordinary work: wage slips, grocery accounts, the pest service, the man who came about the roof after the last storm, the woman who did the heavy curtains twice a year. June sorted it by month, and then by category, and copied the running totals onto a fresh sheet in her own hand. And it was somewhere in the middle of that dull, pleasant, entirely unremarkable task that she noticed the 3 names. They came through every month, the same amounts, listed under household staff. Not large, not small enough to disappear either. And June, who by then knew every person who came through that back door, who knew which day the yard crew came and which one of them took his coffee with 3 sugars, who had washed and folded for every soul under that roof, could not put a face to a single one of them. She checked twice. She checked a third time, going back 11 months, and they were there in every month, steady as a heartbeat. She carried the sheet out to the kitchen, where Odette was working a rolling pin over dough, and she set it on the counter and asked, in the same tone she would have used about the linen order, who these 3 were, because she wanted to know whether they got the holiday envelope like everyone else. Odette Boudreau stopped rolling. She did not look at the sheet at first. She looked at June, and the color went out of her face the way water goes out of a sink, all at once and completely, and she reached over and took the paper out of June's hand. Not roughly, but fast, and folded it twice and put it in her apron pocket. "You listen to me now," Odette said, and her voice had dropped so low that June had to lean in. "If I ever hear you say those 3 names again, in this kitchen or anywhere else, I will walk you out that gate myself with your bag in my own 2 hands, and I want you to understand me. That would be for you, not for me." Then she picked up the rolling pin and went back to the dough, and her hands were not steady, and she did not say another word about it, then or later. And that was the thing. If Odette had laughed, or shrugged, or said they were cousins in Metairie who did the linens, June would have let it go and never thought about it again for the rest of her life. But a woman who had run that house for decades had gone white over a payroll sheet, and had been frightened not of the names but of what would happen to a girl who noticed them. And after that, June could not stop looking. She did not go anywhere she had been told not to go. She simply started paying attention the way she had learned to pay attention in other houses, which is to say completely and without ever appearing to. Who came to the back door and who came to the front? Which cars idled at the gate? Which drawers had dust in the runners and which ones did not? And the desk drawer in the study had none, and it should have, because she cleaned that room and she knew what she had cleaned and when. She opened it on a Thursday afternoon with a dust cloth still in her other hand, and inside was a file with a rubber band around it. And she stood there with the drawer open and read the first page, and then the second, and then she sat down on the floor beside the desk and read all of it. It took her most of an hour. She did not understand every word of it. She understood enough. These were the family's own papers, old ones, the kind that get put away and never looked at again, and they had been brought back and left in a drawer that a man opens 20 times a week, in a room that got cleaned every other day, wrapped in a rubber band like somebody's grocery coupons. Nobody hides a thing where it will be found. You leave a thing where it will be found. She sat on that floor with the light going yellow across the rug and worked it through the way she worked through everything, slowly, all the way to the end. And when she got there, she was very cold and very calm. Then she went up the narrow stairs to the attic room, and she got out the notebook she used for grocery lists, and she copied the file by hand, every page, in her small square handwriting, until well past dark. She slid the notebook under the mattress. She washed her face. And then she went back down through the sleeping house to the study, and knelt in front of the fireplace, and struck the match. She sat where he told her to sit, in the chair across from the desk, with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she laid it out the way she had laid it out for herself on the floor of that room, with a dust cloth still in her hand. That the drawer had no dust in the runners, and it should have. That she cleaned the study on a schedule, and knew what she had cleaned and when, and something had gone into that drawer inside of 6 days. That the papers were not copies, and not forgeries, but the family's own, old, the kind that get boxed and shelved and forgotten, which meant they had come from somewhere inside and gone back inside, and a man does not need to break into a house to return what already belongs to it. He needs a key. That the rubber band was new. That was the part she kept coming back to. Somebody had taken the trouble to make the file look like it had been sitting there for years, and had used a rubber band out of a fresh box to do it. And that no one hides a thing in the second drawer of the desk a man opens 20 times a week. You put a thing there when you want it opened, when you want it found by somebody other than the man who owns the desk, at a moment you have already picked. Rafe Ferraro listened to all of it without moving. He had a way of listening that she had never seen in anyone. A complete stillness. No nodding, no small encouraging sounds, no hand on the chin, nothing that told you where he was. When she stopped, he was quiet for what felt like a long while. Then he asked her 3 questions. What day had she last cleaned inside that drawer? Whether she had touched anything else in the room that night, and whether she had told a single other person, anyone at all, including Odette. She answered all 3. He did not thank her. He did not tell her she had done well, and she found later that she was glad of it, because praise from a man like that would have felt like being handled. He stood up and walked to the window, and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the dark yard for a while, and she could see his reflection in the glass, and it told her nothing. Then he turned around and said, "Go up to bed." And when she was at the door, he said her name, and she stopped. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She said, "Yes, sir," because that was what you said. But she did not understand it. Not that night, and not for a long time after. It was not the sentence itself. It was the way he said it, like a man closing a ledger, like a decision already taken and being announced rather than made. There was something underneath it that did not match the words on top of it, and she carried that mismatch up the narrow stairs with her, and lay in the dark, turning it over the way she turned over anything that did not add. And she thought about the fact that he had not asked her the one question any man in his position should have asked first, which was how a girl who had been in his house for 3 weeks came to be reading the contents of his desk in the middle of the night, and why he ought to believe a word of it. He had not asked. He had not even seemed to consider asking. In the morning, she came down at the usual hour, and Odette Boudreau was already at the range with the coffee going, and she turned around when June came in, and she looked at her. Not the way she had looked at her shoes and her bag and her hair on the front step 2 weeks before. Not the way she had looked at her over that payroll sheet with all the color running out of her face. Something else. She looked at June the way a woman looks at a person she has just been told she is going to have to account for. And June understood in that moment that Rafe Ferraro had spoken to her before either of them came downstairs, and that whatever he had said, Odette had not been able to argue with it. Odette poured a second cup without being asked, and set it on the table across from her own. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you didn't sleep." Odette sent her down with the coffee because Odette had bread in the oven, and that was the only reason. And June thought about that afterward for a long time, how little it takes. The stairs to the lower room went down off the back hall behind a door that was usually locked, and was not locked that afternoon, and June came down them carefully with the tray, and the door at the bottom stood open a hand's width, and she stopped because there were voices, and stopping was the mistake. Rafe was sitting in a wooden chair with his forearms on his knees, and his hands loose between them, leaning slightly forward, the way a man sits when he is listening to a friend describe a problem with a truck. Across from him, a heavy man in a good jacket was standing, and had been standing a while by the look of him, and was sweating through the collar. Nobody else was in the room. Nobody was near anybody. There was nothing on the table between them but a manila envelope, unopened. "Whitney Bank on Poydras," Rafe said. "The business account and the other one." He said it the way a man reads off a delivery address. "Sacred Heart for your daughter. She started in August. That's a good school. My mother's cousin taught there." The heavy man opened his mouth. Rafe kept going, at the same speed, without any change at all. Dupree out of Chalmette. Landrew with the 2 cranes at the Napoleon Avenue wharf. Both of them take my call in the morning, and both of them will want to know why 60 men who unloaded steel all summer are being told there's a delay on their coverage. He paused. Not for effect, for breath. There's no delay. It came in and it stopped somewhere. And everybody in this room knows where it stopped. The heavy man said something about cash flow and a bridge and the end of the quarter. He said it fast and then faster, and his voice climbed, and Rafe let him finish all of it, every word, without interrupting once, and the letting him finish was somehow worse than being cut off. When it was over, the room was very quiet. You have until noon tomorrow to put it back, Rafe said. After that, it stops being my business. He did not raise his voice. He never came close. That was the part June could not get past afterward. Lying in the attic room with the window open and the barges working somewhere out past the rooftops. He had not threatened anything. He had not promised anything. He had simply said out loud, in order, the things that were true and the things that would happen. And then he had told the man there was a door and a clock, and the man had begun to shake. That was all. Nobody had lifted a hand. Nobody had raised anything but the temperature in a windowless room. And she understood, standing on those stairs with a tray in her hands, that this was what the name meant, that it had never been about anybody's fists, that a man who knows what school your daughter goes to and says it out loud in a mild voice has already done the only thing he needs to do. Her hands had gone numb around the tray. The cup went over. It did not break. It only rolled and rang once against the metal rim, a small bright sound, and it was the loudest thing that had happened in that house all week. The heavy man's head came around, and Rafe Ferraro looked up, slowly, and found her through the gap in the door, and he held her there with his eyes for 2 full seconds, and there was nothing in his face at all, and then he looked back at the man in front of him, as if she had never been there. He found her that evening in the pantry, putting away the dry goods, and he stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and said it without any preamble at all. I'll pay you through the end of the month, and I won't ask you a single question about why. There's a bus at Canal in the morning. She kept her hands on the shelf a moment longer, then turned around. Do you want me to go? That's not what I said. No, she said. It isn't. And she looked at him. This man she had watched put a grown human being into a sweat without lifting so much as a finger. And she found that her voice was steady, and she was surprised by that. And she went ahead anyway. I worked nights for a while. Office buildings mostly, but before that I cleaned for a crew doing demolition out past Zachary. I knew those men. Not well, enough. And when one of them came off a scaffold and broke something that mattered, nobody paid a dime toward it. Not the company, not the insurance, nobody. He went home, and he stayed home, and that was the end of him. She wiped her palms on her apron because they had gone damp. So I'm not frightened of what you did today. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I am. Those 60 men are going to get what belongs to them, and they'll never know why. She stopped, and then she said the rest of it, because leaving it out would have been a kind of lie. I'm only trying to work out whether you did it for them, or because you like the way it feels. The house made its small noises around them, the tick of the pipes, a shutter somewhere. Rafe Ferraro did not move and did not answer, and the silence went on long enough that she began to wonder whether she had just talked herself onto that bus. Then he said, So am I. And he went out through the kitchen, and she heard the back door, and that was the whole of it. 10 days later, Toby Landry, who worked in the garage and had never in his life let a piece of news sit unshared, told her the rest while she was hanging sheets. The contractor had put every dollar back before noon the next day. Then he had sold the house on Fontainebleau, pulled his daughter out of Sacred Heart, moved the family to Texas without a word to anybody, no notice, no forwarding, and the whole thing done inside of 3 weeks. Nobody laid a hand on him, Toby said, with a kind of wonder. That's the thing about Mr. Ferraro. He don't have to. June went on with the sheets and did not answer, and that night she lay awake, understanding that she had watched a man be erased from a city with nothing but a mild voice and a list of things that were already true, and that whatever it was she was living inside of now, she had walked into it with her eyes open. She made the coffee differently after that. Toby had told her once how Milo took it, chicory dark with condensed milk stirred in until it went the color of river water. And she had filed it away the way she filed away everything, and one morning she simply made it. She set the cup down and went on with what she was doing. Rafe picked it up and stopped. He looked into it. He did not ask who had told her, and he did not thank her, and he did not say his brother's name, which she had not expected him to. He drank all of it, standing at the counter, and set the cup in the sink himself, and went out. He never mentioned it again. She made it that way every morning for the rest of the time she lived under that roof. And on the Saturday of that same week, Odette Boudreau came into the kitchen and put a folded apron down on the table in front of her, a new one, still with the crease from the store in it, and it was the right size, which meant she had gone and found out the right size. "There," Odette said, not looking at her, already moving toward the stove. "You'll do." It came on an ordinary morning, which is how those things come. June was at the counter with flour on her wrists when she heard the front door, and then nothing. No boots on the stairs, no chair scraping in the study, just nothing. And she wiped her hands and went out into the hall and found him standing in the doorway of the kitchen with an envelope in his hand. It was already open. He was not reading it. He had read it somewhere between the gate and the house, and now he was simply holding it, and he was looking at a point on the floor about 6 feet in front of him. And June had lived in enough houses to know exactly what a man looks like in the first minute after the ground has gone out from under him. Odette came in behind her, took one look, and went back out and closed the door. "Meridian Harbor Partners," Rafe said. He said the name, the way you say the name of a disease somebody in the family has. They bought the paper on the deep water berth. The note my father signed. Before I was old enough to know what a note was. They're calling the whole balance. 45 days. June did not know finance. She knew what 45 days sounded like in a man's mouth. What happens if you can't pay it? The berth goes, and the berth is the license. He was still looking at the floor. You can't work a wharf in this city without a berth the port recognizes. No berth, no license, no contracts, no bonded cargo, nothing. Everything my family does that has a piece of paper behind it runs through that one strip of water. He turned the envelope over in his hand once, absently, the way a man turns a coin. Take that away, and what's left is what people already think we are. That's the whole point of it. That's what he's buying. Who's he? Curtis Bramwell. He said it without any heat, which somehow made it worse. He's been going up and down this river for 3 years, picking off berths from families who got behind. Nobody's ever laid eyes on him doing anything. He doesn't do anything. He waits, and then he sends a letter, and then a lawyer, and it's over before anybody understands there was a fight. And then he said, quieter, "That's where Milo was. That berth, 4 years ago." He did not say anything else about it, and June did not ask, and something in the way he stopped talking told her not to, and she filed it where she filed things. He put the envelope down on the kitchen table and stood there with his hands flat on either side of it. "Warren's going to tell me to sell it," he said, mostly to himself. "He'll be here by supper, and that's what he'll say. Take the loss, keep the warehouses, live." Is he right? He usually is. Rafe looked up at her then. That's the trouble with Warren. June crossed the kitchen and pulled out the chair on the other side of the table and sat down in it, and did not ask anybody's permission to do it. She had spent 4 years in houses where a girl waited to be told, and something in her had finished with that, and she watched him notice. "Then tell me everything you know about Curtis Bramwell," she said. "Not the parts you think matter. All of it. Where he came from, who he buys from, what he does with the land after. Who else on this river got a letter like that one, and what happened to them? Names, dates, whatever you have on paper and whatever you only heard at a bar." He looked at her across that table for a long moment, and she held it, and she did not look down. "You clean my house," he said. "Yes," she said, "and I read your ledgers, and I found what was in your desk, and you told me I wasn't going anywhere." She put her hands flat on the wood the way he had. "So sit down, Mr. Ferraro, and start at the beginning." She worked at the kitchen table, because the study had a desk that belonged to somebody else, and the kitchen belonged to her. And she spread the 3 folders out under the low lamp, and did not go up to bed at all. She was not an accountant, and she knew it, and she did not try to be one. She did what she had taught herself to do on the floors of empty offices, with a mop bucket beside her, and other people's ledgers in her lap, which was to read the same page 4 times until it stopped hiding. By the time the early light broke gray and quiet over the rooftops, she had 3 things written out in her small square hand. The first was the interest. The note carried a rate that looked ordinary, but the way the balance had been compounded did not match the way the agreement said it would be compounded, and the difference was not large in any one year, and became something else entirely compounded across several decades. The second was the call, buried in an appendix, in a sentence built the way a snare is built, was a clause allowing the holder to demand the whole balance on 45 days if certain maintenance conditions were not met, and she made a note beside it that she wanted to know who decided whether they had been met. The third was the pattern. 4 other berths on that stretch of river had changed hands in 3 years. She laid them out in order on a single sheet. Who held the paper, when the letter came, how long the family had lasted after it, and looked at what she had made. And it was not 4 accidents. It was one method, used 4 times, getting better each time. Warren Kestrel came before noon, hat in hand out of habit rather than deference, 62 years old, with a voice like a rasp on hardwood, and he sat down and said what everyone knew he would say. Sell the berth, take the money, keep the 3 warehouses and the trucking and the leases and live to be an old man. It's one strip of water, Rafe. Your daddy bought worse and sold worse. And Beau, who was 28 and had his father's shoulders and none of his patience, waited until Warren went out to the car and then leaned on the doorframe and said it quietly, the way you offer a man a cigarette. 2 nights. That's all I need. He's got a house on Lake Pontchartrain, and he keeps 2 people around him, and neither of them is any good. He shrugged. This whole thing goes away, and nobody ever hears the name Bramwell again. That's how your father would have handled it. That's how my father handled it for him. Rafe was quiet for a while. When he answered, he did not answer angrily, and June, standing at the sink with her back to them and her hands in the water, understood that this was the most serious thing she had heard said in that house. The old way would solve Bramwell, he said. It would also prove to every person in this city that they've been right about my family for 60 years. Every one of them, all at once. He looked at Beau. I made my brother a promise. We come up onto dry land or we don't deserve any of it. That was the whole of it. That was the last real conversation he and I had. Beau's jaw moved. He said, suit yourself, and pushed off the doorframe, and went out. And June heard the car doors and the gravel, and she did not turn around, and she did not think about it again for a long time. Then it was just the 2 of them and the folders. It won't work, Rafe said. Prior families had lawyers too. They had lawyers, June said. They didn't have this. She turned the sheet around and pushed it across the table, the 4 berths in order, the letters, the months. 4 times, Mr. Ferraro, the same shape every time. That's not a man taking advantage of bad luck. That's a man running a machine. And machines have parts, and parts can be shown to a judge. She tapped the appendix page. And we need to find out who signs off on those maintenance conditions, because whoever it is has been deciding when to pull the string. Rafe looked at the sheet for a long moment. Then he said, We, she said. Unless you've got an objection to the word. He did not. He picked up the telephone and called a woman named Miriam Vaughn, a civil attorney off Poydras Street, with 3 pencils in her shirt pocket and glasses on a chain, who had never in 20 years taken a call from that family, and who came anyway, that same afternoon, and sat down at the kitchen table, and read June's 3 pages, twice without saying a word. It came up over breakfast, the way the important things do, sideways and out of nothing. Poppy had her pencils out beside her plate, and she was working on something with a lot of cranes in it, and she said, without looking up, that her birthday was in November, and that she was going to have a cake shaped like a boat. And then she said, When's yours? June was at the counter with her back to the room. I don't know, she said. She said it the way you say you do not care for okra. The file has an estimated date on it. That's all there is. The kitchen changed. Odette Boudreau had a knife in her hand, and half an onion in front of her, and she simply stopped, the knife still down against the board, and did not move. Rafe was reading something at the end of the table, and he raised his head. Neither of them said a word. Poppy, who was 7, and who had heard a word she did not know, put her chin in her hand and asked what estimated meant. And June turned around and told her, plainly, because a child asks a plain question and deserves a plain answer, and because it had never once occurred to her that this was a thing other people found unbearable to hear. She said that when she was born, nobody wrote it down properly. She said that a nurse had found her at a hospital, and that her mother had gone, and that when they made the file they had to put something in the little box, so they guessed. She said the file said on or about, and that on or about had been her birthday her whole life, and that it was no trouble, because a date is only a number, and she had never much minded. Poppy thought about it for a second, said, okay, and went back to her cranes, because she was 7, and because June had said it in a voice with nothing wrong in it. Odette started cutting the onion again. Rafe looked back down at his papers. And June wiped the counter and moved on to the next thing, and did not think about it again. 9 days later, he came into the kitchen in the evening, when she was alone with the account folders, and put an envelope on the table in front of her, and stood back from it. "Open it when I'm gone if you'd rather." "What is it?" "It's yours," he said. "That's all." And he went out. She opened it standing up. Inside was a copy of a birth record from a hospital in Baton Rouge that no longer existed under that name, the original intake sheet, the paper the nurses had filled in at the time. She saw the date first. A real one, not on or about. A day, in a month, in a year, written in somebody's steady hand at the moment it happened. Then the time, and then the weight, 6 pounds and 11 ounces. And there was something obscene and beautiful about how small that was, and how carefully somebody had recorded it. And then her eyes went down the sheet to the line for the name, and the name was not blank, and it had not been filled in later by an office. It was in a different hand from the rest of the form, looping, uneven, written by somebody lying down. It said June. And beside it, in the margin, where the form did not ask for anything and there was no box and no reason at all, the same hand had written, June, because it is the prettiest month of the year. She read it 4 times. Her mother had named her. Her mother had stopped, in whatever state she was in, and had thought about it, and had chosen something, and had liked it enough to explain herself to a piece of paper that nobody was ever supposed to read. She had thought about the baby. Before she went, she had thought about the baby, and every single thing June Merritt had believed about the beginning of her own life, quietly, for 19 years, without ever once saying it out loud to another living soul, was wrong. She did not cry in that kitchen. She folded the sheet along its own creases, and put it back in the envelope, and went to find him. And he was in the hall, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Ferraro," and her voice was almost level, and he did not say anything. And she went up the 2 flights, and then the narrow stairs to the attic room, and shot the bolt, and only then, with the door locked, and the river out the window, and the whole house below her, did she sit down on the floor with her back against the bed and let it come. Downstairs, Rafe Ferraro stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase, with one hand on the newel post. He did not go up. He stood there in the dark of the 3rd floor, landing for a long time, until there was no more sound from the room above him, and then he went back down and did not mention it, then or ever. The second envelope came 11 days after the first one, and this time it was Miriam Vaughn who brought it, and she came in through the kitchen with her glasses already off and said, "Close the door," which Odette did, and the 3 of them and Rafe sat down at that table with the door shut. And Poppy was at school, and knew nothing about any of it, then or afterward. It was a petition filed in family court to revisit the visitation schedule. The name on it was Loretta Sable. She was 63 years old, and she lived in Gentilly in the house she had lived in for 31 years. And she was the mother of Milo Ferraro's wife. And June had never heard her name spoken once in that house, which told her something all by itself. "She's asking for more time with the child," Miriam said. "That's the whole of the filing. More weekends, some part of the summer, alternating holidays." She set it down. "It's not a hostile document, Rafe. I want you to hear me say that before you read it. There's nothing ugly in here. A grandmother is asking the court to let her see her granddaughter more than she does now." Rafe read it anyway, all of it, and when he was finished, he put it face down on the table and pushed it a few inches away from himself, and did not say anything for a while, and then he said, "She's not wrong." He said it quietly. "She buried her daughter. Then she buried her son-in-law." He looked at the window, and she's been through that front gate maybe 4 times in 4 years, and every one of those times she sat on the edge of a chair like the furniture was going to bite her, and left inside of an hour. He turned his glass a quarter turn on the wood. "It isn't Poppy. She loves that child. She can't stand this house. She can't stand what the name on it did to her daughter's life, and I have never once been able to tell her she was wrong about that either." Miriam let that sit. Then she said, "There's a second thing." She took a second page out of the folder. "The attorney of record is Vance and Groves. That is a good firm, and it is an expensive one, and Mrs. Sable retired from the school board 11 years ago." June, who had not said a word, said, "She isn't paying for it." "No," Miriam said, "she is not." Nobody in that kitchen needed the name said out loud, and Miriam said it anyway, because she was the kind of lawyer who believed in saying things out loud. The retainer came through a client trust account. Same firm handles Meridian's local filings. June sat with her hands flat on the table and worked it through the way she worked through everything, and what she came to was worse than anything she had expected, because there was nothing illegal in it anywhere. There was no threat in it. There was no lie in it. A woman had a real grievance, and a real right, and no money. And a man with a great deal of money had simply removed the only obstacle between her and the thing she already wanted, and he had done it without ever once telling her what to want. He didn't push her, June said. He didn't have to. And she thought about how it must have been done. Some quiet afternoon in Gentilly, a man in a good coat sitting in a front room with his hat on his knee, being kind, being patient, letting a tired woman talk about her daughter for an hour before he said anything at all, and then saying the only sentence he ever needed to say, which she was certain, later, when she finally heard it repeated word for word, had been said gently. "You do have the right, Mrs. Sable. Nobody has ever been willing to pay for you to use it." The piece went up on a local news site on a Tuesday. 400 words about a 19-year-old girl out of the foster system who had turned up in a certain house on Prytania Street and was somehow now involved in a lawsuit, and it managed in every one of those 400 words to suggest something without ever saying it. Odette saw it first and did not show her. Toby saw it and made the mistake of mentioning it out loud in the kitchen. June read it once on the shop telephone and handed it back and went on with the linens, because she had been talked about by people who had never met her since she was 14, and had long ago worked out that there is nothing to be done with it, except keep folding. Rafe said nothing at all. That was what she noticed. No jaw, no stillness, no glass set down too carefully. He read it, and then he went into the study and closed the door, and she heard the low murmur of one telephone call that did not last 3 minutes, and he came out and asked Odette what was for supper. By Friday the article was gone. So was the site. 2 national advertisers pulled inside a day. Then a third. Then the bank that carried the office lease on Barron Street called the note, and by the middle of the following week, the whole operation had been folded up, and the doors locked, and the 12 people who worked there were looking for something else. He brought her the printout himself, a blank white page where the story had been, error text in the middle of it, and he put it on the kitchen table in front of her, the way a man puts down a receipt. "Done," he said. June looked at it for a while. Then she said, "You just did the exact thing they wrote about you." He did not answer. 12 people lost their jobs this week. She kept her voice low, because Odette was in the pantry, and because raising it would have made it about temper instead of about the thing itself. Not the man who wrote it. He'll be at another desk by Christmas. Men like him always are. The woman who sold the ads. Whoever answered that phone. Somebody's paying a note on a car with that money. She folded the printout in half without looking at it. "I didn't ask you to do that, and I don't want my good name bought with somebody else's kitchen table." He stood there on the other side of that table with his hands at his sides. He had made a man disappear from a city in 3 weeks with a mild voice and a list of true things. He had sat still while 60 men were stolen from, and had put every dollar back without ever raising his hand. And he had no answer for a 19-year-old girl in a gray uniform, in his own kitchen. None. Not one word. And for the first time in his adult life, Rafe Ferraro simply stood there and took it. Then he picked up the folded paper and put it in his shirt pocket and went out through the back door into the yard and stayed out there past dark. It was Odette's sentence on the front step that came back to her, months later, the way those things do. The 7th one this year. June had never once thought about it again until the night she sat with the payroll folders and realized she had 6 predecessors and had never heard a single one of their names. And the next morning she went to the licensed placement office on 3rd Street and asked, politely, as a current employee, for a list of the household referrals for that address. And a young man at the counter printed it without any fuss, because there was nothing irregular in it to print. Ordinary live and domestic positions, filled through a licensed agency, wages recorded and taxes withheld. 5 of the 6 had simply quit. She tracked down 2 of them, and they told her the same thing in almost the same words. That nobody in that house had ever done them any harm at all, that they had been paid on time and spoken to civilly, and that they had left because a person can only stand so many closed doors and lowered voices before her nerves go, and the 6th had moved to Mobile with her husband. That left 1. Marlene Ruddick had not quit. She had been paid, and she had gone. The apartment was in Mid-City, 2nd floor, clean, with a window unit and a couch that still had the tag on the leg, and a stack of community college books on the table with a highlighter lying across them. Marlene was 22. She opened the door and knew who June was before June said one word, and she let her in anyway, which said something. She did not look at her. Not once through the whole conversation. She looked at the books, and the window, and her own hands. They gave me enough to start over, she said. Do you know what that means? Do you have any idea? Nobody has ever given me one single thing in my entire life. Not one. And a man in a good coat sits in my mother's front room and offers me a year of rent and my tuition paid, and all I have to do is take a job I was going to take anyway, and then leave when they tell me to leave. She laughed, and it was not a laugh. Go on and stand there. Stand there and judge me. Then she did look up, once, fast, like touching something hot. Where are you sleeping tonight, June? June had no answer for that. She said she would need her to say it in front of a judge, and Marlene Ruddick said no, and said it twice more when June asked again, and shut the door with the chain still hanging loose, and June stood in the stairwell for a minute, and then went back down. She did not go to Prytania Street. She took the bus back to 3rd Street, to the second-floor office, with the half-drawn blinds, and Corinne Pelletier looked up from her desk, and did not pretend, not for a second, and that was somehow the worst part of it. She did not say, "What are you talking about?" She opened the bottom drawer, and took out a rubber-banded stack of medical billing statements, and set them on the desk and pushed them across, and June looked at them without touching them, the account number, the balances, the transfer notation on the last page, showing the whole obligation sold to a servicing company, and under the servicing company, in small type, a name she had come to know. My boy is 15, Corinne said. That's all I'm going to tell you about him, and you're not going to ask me anything else. Her hands were flat on the desk. So what do you want me to say to you, June? I traded you for that. I knew what I was doing when I put your paperwork in that folder. I knew, and I did it, and I would do it again this afternoon. She stopped, and her chin went, once, and she got it back. They wanted somebody with nobody, that's what the man said. Somebody with nobody. June stood there a long moment. I'm not going to forgive you, she said. I want you to hear that from me straight, because you'll hear a lot of soft things from a lot of people, and none of them will mean anything. She picked up the top statement, looked at the name of the servicing company one more time, and set it back down on the stack, square. But I understand you, and that's worse, in a way, for both of us. She went to the door and put her hand on it. Now I need you to say all of it in a courtroom. It was waiting for her 4 blocks from the office on 3rd Street, a black sport utility with the engine running and the glass too dark to see through. And the back door opened before she reached it, and a man in a gray suit leaned out and said her name and asked, very pleasantly, whether she had 10 minutes. She could have kept walking. She thought about that afterward, more than she thought about anything else. There were people on the sidewalk and city traffic somewhere behind her and the door of a sandwich shop propped open across the way, and she could have simply kept walking, and instead she got in, because she wanted to know, because she had always wanted to know, because that was the thing in her that had read ledgers by the light under a closet door. The man was in his 50s, unremarkable, the kind of face that has spent 30 years being forgotten on purpose. He did not introduce himself. He did not say who he worked for. He asked whether the air was too cold, and adjusted it when she said nothing, and then he pulled down the folding table between the seats and laid 3 pieces of paper on it, one at a time, evenly spaced, the way a man deals a hand. The first was a cashier's check. She looked at the number for a while. It was not an insulting number, and it was not an absurd one. It was exactly, precisely the amount that a person who had studied her file would know was the largest sum she could imagine and still believe in. The second was a letter of admission to a state university, spring term, with a full scholarship attached, the funding already named, a line for her signature, and nothing else required. The third was a lease, 12 months, a 1-bedroom in a decent part of town, utilities included, already made out in her name. Not an offer to arrange these things. The things themselves, done, sitting on a folding table in a car. Nobody's going to touch you, the man said. Nobody's going to follow you. I want to be very clear about that, because I imagine you've been thinking about it since you sat down. He folded his hands. You're 19 years old. You've been in that house since summer. You owe those people nothing at all. What do they pay you a month, June? She did not answer that. She looked at the 3 pages, and she looked at them for a long time, longer than the man expected, long enough that he sat back and let her. because she was not being brave in that minute. She was doing arithmetic. She was thinking about a second-floor apartment in mid-city, with a window unit, and a couch with the tag still on the leg and a highlighter lying across a stack of books, and about a girl 3 years older than she was who could not lift her eyes off her own hands. She was thinking that Marlene Ruddick had not been weak. Marlene Ruddick had been offered exactly this, in exactly this tone, by a man exactly this polite, and had taken it, and the truth June had to sit with was that there was no version of the world in which she got to feel superior about that. She was thinking about how much she wanted the second page. Not the check, the second page. She wanted it so badly that her eyes went hot, and she made herself look at it until they stopped. Then the man turned over the fourth sheet, which had been under the others the whole time, face down, and slid it up beside them. A short statement withdrawing her account and declining to appear. 4 lines. A place at the bottom for her name. "That's all," he said. "You sign that and you never think about any of this again." June sat with her hands in her lap. Outside the tinted glass, a woman went by with 2 grocery bags and a child holding her belt loop, and a bus horn sounded again, farther off. "You're right," she said at last. "They don't pay me enough. Not for any of it." She reached out and squared the 3 pages into a neat stack with 2 fingers, the way she squared everything, and pushed them back across the table toward him. "But they asked me my name." She opened the door herself. "Tell whoever sent you that I said the word estimated for 19 years, and somebody in that house went and found out the real one. You can't put that on a check." Miriam Vaughn called it a motion to exclude, and said it in the voice of a woman who has watched this particular door close on other people. If they could not produce the executed original of the decades-old note, wet ink, seal and all, before the hearing opened, then every page of June's work went out with it, because you cannot ask a court to find that a copy was altered without showing the court the thing it was altered from. And the original was not in a bank, and not in a lawyer's vault. It was in the old Port Records Annex, a long, low building on the Batcher side of the levee that the board had stopped using years ago and never emptied, where 4 decades of executed instruments sat in cardboard on steel shelving 11 inches off a concrete floor. The storm came up out of the Gulf on a Thursday and turned north, and by that evening, every station in the city was showing the same thing, a wide, slow spiral and a surge forecast. And June stood in the kitchen looking at the screen and understood before anybody said it out loud. The building was going to take water. When the water went back out, everything on those bottom shelves would be pulp, and every one of it would go into the record as storm loss, and no court in Louisiana would ever hear the words wet ink again. It was not weather. It was a clock, and somebody had known for 3 days which way it was turning. Odette took Poppy to her house on Elysian Fields before the rain started, with a flashlight and a milk crate of comic books and a bag of pretzels, and the child thought the whole thing was a party. Then it was the 3 of them in the truck, Rafe driving, Toby Landry in the middle with a bolt wrench across his knees because he had refused to be left, and June with the tailgate keys and a folded copy of the annex floor plan. The rain came sideways off the river. The parking apron was already underwater at the low end, up over the curb, and the truck pushed a wake through it. The roll door on the riverside was up. Not broken. Up. 3 inches of standing water inside and rising, and 2 vehicles parked around the far corner where the building would have hidden them from the levee road. There was a light moving somewhere in the back. Rafe said 1 word to Toby about the truck and went in. What happened in there took less than 2 minutes, and June remembered almost none of it in order. She remembered the sound most, the roll door slamming and catching and slamming again in the wind against its frame, a huge flat metal noise that came about every 4 seconds. Boots on steel shelving, a flashlight beam swinging up across the ceiling and going out, somebody's voice saying wait, and somebody else saying nothing at all, water moving around her shins in a way that felt alive. There were 3 of them, and they had not come to carry anything out. That was the thing she understood as soon as she got past the first row, because their hands were empty, and there was no dolly and no truck back to the door. They had come to make sure nobody else carried anything out. They had come to stand in a building and let the river do the work. Rafe went through the middle aisle. There was a scuffle at the end of it. Brief, mostly noise, a shoulder into shelving and the whole steel rack ringing like a struck pipe, and boxes coming down. And Toby swung the bolt wrench once at nothing and caught the wall, and the sound of it was enormous in there. June did not stop. She had the floor plan in her head, and she went down the 4th aisle counting bays, and found the year, and found the quarter, and pulled the box. And it was heavy, and the bottom was already soft, and she got both arms under it and held it against her chest and turned around and walked back out through the water without running, because running with a wet box is how you lose the box. Headlights swung across the front of the building. Somebody shouted something about the levee road, and then the two vehicles were pulling out fast through the standing water and gone. And it was just the three of them and the rain, and that door still banging. And June stood in the bed of the truck with the box in her arms and her uniform soaked through to the skin, and would not let go of it. Not for Toby, not for Rafe, not the whole way home. They dried the box on the kitchen table with the oven on low and every towel in the house, and the note itself came out of it whole, seal and signature and all, which was the thing they had gone for. But a box that size holds more than one document, and June, who could not have left a file unsorted if the building were burning, spent the next 2 days going through the rest of it page by page while it dried, and that was how she found the maintenance file for the deep water berth. 3 inspection reports in 2 years. The first one, 17 months before Milo Ferraro died, noting deterioration in the decking on the downstream end and recommending replacement of the stringers. The second, 8 months later, the same inspector, less patient, underlining the word structural. The third, filed 61 days before it happened, 3 pages, with a hand-drawn sketch of the section in question and a line at the bottom recommending immediate closure of that portion of the deck pending repair. Attached to each one was a capital expenditure request, and attached to each request was a denial. June sat very still and read the denials 4 times, and then she went and found the loan file and read the appendix clause again, the one she had flagged in her own handwriting weeks before, with a note asking who decided whether the maintenance conditions had been met. And there it was in plain language. Under the terms of that original note, any capital expenditure on the encumbered property above a stated threshold required written approval from the holder of the paper. Whoever held the note held the pen. Meridian had held it for 6 years. And on all 3 denials, in the internal record, the reason given was the same. Owner deferred. She got the signature cards out and laid them side by side under the lamp and looked at them for a long time. And she was not an expert and did not need to be. The R was wrong. It closed at the top. Rafe Ferraro's R had never closed at the top in his life. Not on a check, not on a receipt, not on the note he had left her on the kitchen counter about the coffee. She put the 2 pages together and carried them into the study and put them down in front of him and said, "You need to read this sitting down." And he read it standing up anyway, because that is how men like that receive things. He read all 3. He did not say anything at all. Then he said, quietly, "I signed those." "You didn't." "I've spent 4 years being sure I did." He was still looking at the paper. "They came to me after. Warren brought me the file himself, because he thought somebody in the family ought to be the one to hand it to me. And it was all in there. 3 requests, 3 deferrals, my name at the bottom of every one." His voice did not change. "I didn't remember signing them. That was the part I could never get around. I signed 400 things that year. My father was dying, and I was learning the business out of a filing cabinet, and I signed whatever was put in front of me, and I decided that was exactly the point, that a man who signs without reading is worse than a man who reads and says no." He set the page down on the desk very carefully, squaring it with the edge. "I told Milo to go down and look at the downstream end. That afternoon, I told him to go." June said, "Somebody wrote your name on those. Somebody wanted the money kept in the account, and then wanted a reason on paper if anybody ever came asking, and the cheapest reason available was you." She kept her voice level, because she understood that anything else would have been unbearable in that room. "Your brother didn't die because you were careless. He died because a man in an office did the arithmetic on a deck and decided replacing it cost more than not replacing it." Rafe folded the page once, along the middle, and put it in his shirt pocket. He said, "Excuse me," which she had never heard him say to anybody. He went out through the kitchen and out the back door into the yard, and he stood out there under the oaks with his back to the house for a very long time, and nobody went out after him, and June turned off the lamp in the study and let him have the dark. He was gone from the house before first light, and the truck was gone with him, and Odette found the coffee untouched and said nothing. And by the middle of the morning, June had called Toby twice and stood in the study with her hands flat on the desk and understood exactly where a man goes when he has just been told the 4 years he built his guilt out of were somebody else's construction. She took the old sedan. It was raining again, the thin, steady kind that comes after the big weather has gone through and stays for days. And the levee road was empty and brown, and the river beside it ran high and full of debris. The gate to the deep water berth stood open. His truck was parked crooked inside it, with the driver's door hanging, and there was a canvas bag on the passenger seat, and June looked at that bag through the wet glass, and did not touch it, and did not need to open it to know it was packed for a night's work. Up at the head of the pier, under the light, there were 4 men standing. One of them was Beau Kestrel. He saw her and did not look away and did not come toward her either, and that told her the whole shape of it. And Rafe was 30 yards off from all of them, out on the timber deck alone, standing in the rain with his hands at his sides, looking at the water. She walked out to him. She did not run, and she did not call his name. When she was close enough, she stopped. And she did not say don't, and she did not say please, and she did not say a single word about the law or the case or the hearing. "If you walk through that gate tonight," she said, "then Poppy grows up hearing people talk about her uncle the same way they used to talk about her grandfather, every year of her life. And by the time she's old enough to want to know who her father was, there won't be one person left on this earth who can tell her." The rain came off the brim of nothing, off his hair, down his face. "There'll just be the name," she said. He stood there a long time, long enough that the men up at the head of the pier began to shift, long enough that she thought she had lost. Then he turned and walked back up the deck past her without a word, and reached into the truck, and took the bag off the seat, and carried it to the edge, and dropped it into the river. And it went under, and did not come back up, and he stood watching the place where it had been. Beau Kestrel said something. Rafe did not answer him. The 4 of them were gone inside a minute. It happened on the way back. He was walking ahead of her on the downstream end, and the deck gave, one board, and then the whole section of it, a sound like a door being kicked, and he went through to the thigh, and the leg turned and caught under something below, and stopped him there. June was on her knees at the edge of the hole before she had decided to be. The water was coming up under there, brown and fast, and she got both hands under his arm and pulled and could not move him, and pulled again with everything she had, and could not move him at all. And that was the moment she would carry for the rest of her life, that she was not strong enough, that all the reading and all the arithmetic and all the standing straight in front of powerful men came to nothing against the plain fact of a 19-year-old girl's arms. "Toby's at the gate," she said. "Look at me. I'm going to run and I'm coming straight back." And she ran. And then she was back, kneeling on the wet boards with the rain going down her collar, and Toby's headlights were still 4 minutes out on the levee road. And there was nothing to do with those 4 minutes except talk. So she talked. She told him the water was not coming up as fast as it looked. She told him about the box drying on the kitchen table, and which pages had come through, and which had not. She told him what Poppy had drawn that week, a tugboat with a face on it. She told him about the R that closed at the top. She talked without stopping, about anything, about nothing, her voice steady, her hand flat on his shoulder, until the lights came up the road. They got him out. The leg was turned and swollen and not broken, and at the house Odette had the kitchen lit and towels down and did not ask one question. And afterward, on the back steps in the rain, he did not take June's hand, and he did not touch her face. He pulled his coat off and put it around her shoulders, and then he moved away and sat down on the step below her, and neither of them said anything for a long while. Miriam Vaughn worked through June's notebook against the family's own inventory list for 3 days, and came back with an answer nobody had wanted. The file was genuine, every page of it. Not a forgery, not a reconstruction, not one altered line anywhere in it. Those were the elder Ferraro's papers from his own working years, catalogued and boxed and shelved in the family storage on the 3rd floor at some point in the 1980s, and they had sat there ever since, and somebody had taken them out of that room and carried them down 2 flights and put them in a desk drawer with a fresh rubber band around them. "You understand what that means," Miriam said. "There's nothing to attack. If the police had come and found that in your study, you could not have called it a plant, because it isn't one. It's yours. It always was." And June, who had said the same thing on the floor of that study with a dust cloth in her hand months before, said the only part that was left. So somebody in this house opened that room. It was Toby who gave it to them, and he did it without any idea what he was doing, the way he did most things. He said that Beau had been up on the 3rd floor twice that summer, once for a long time, and that he had thought nothing of it, because Beau Kestrel had been walking in and out of that house since he was a boy, and had a key the way his father had a key. He said it in the garage with a rag in his hands, and then he saw their faces, and he stopped talking. The three names came the rest of the way apart in one afternoon. Household staff, monthly, small enough to be invisible, drawn against the house account that Beau had been signing on for years because his father had signed on it before him. The people did not exist. The money had gone somewhere. Miriam followed it 2 banks over and stopped, because 2 banks over was enough, and it was not the money. That was the thing that took June the longest to accept, and she understood it fully only when she heard him say it out loud. It had never been about the money at all. Warren Kestrel came on a Sunday. He came alone, and he brought his son with him, which is not the same as coming together, and June saw him from the kitchen window, walking up from the car with his hat already off and held against his chest in both hands. And she had known that man for months, and had never once seen him without his hat on his head outdoors. He walked his son into the study and shut the door. What was said in there she heard only the end of, and only because she was in the hall. She heard Beau's voice, not defiant, worse than defiant, earnest. She heard him say that this family had been going down for 6 years, and that everybody could see it except the man in charge of it, and that the only way out was for Rafe to fall, and for somebody to be standing there ready to pick it up and run it the way it had been run when it worked. She heard him say, "I never wanted the money," and she believed him, and that was the sickening part. Then it was quiet a long time. When Rafe spoke, he spoke the way he always spoke. "The old way solves you in one night," he said. "Your father knows how it goes. He's watched it. You'd be gone by the weekend, and nobody in this city would ask a single question. Because that is exactly what everybody already believes about my family, and you spent all summer proving them right on my behalf." Another silence. "You're going to leave Louisiana this week. You're not coming back to this city while I'm alive in it. Every account with your name on it is closed as of Friday." And then, to the father, in a different voice, "The house in Gentilly, the moving, whatever it costs to set him up wherever you land, I'll cover all of it. You go with him, Warren. He can't be by himself right now." The door opened. Warren Kestrel came out with his hat still in his hands and his face gone loose the way an old man's face goes when the worst thing has happened, and he has been given something anyway. And behind him, from inside the room, Rafe said, "That's a choice my father never gave anybody. I want you both to remember that it came from me." Miriam laid the last of it out on the kitchen table on a Tuesday. All of it side by side. The referral records, the payroll ghosts, the dates Beau had been on the 3rd floor, and the placement dates of every girl the agency had sent to that address in a year. And when the pieces were in a row, June saw it before anybody said it. It had never been about spying. Nobody had ever wanted a girl to listen at doors and report back. They had wanted a girl in that house on a specific week, with a specific shape of life behind her, so that when the police came in and opened that drawer, there would be somebody standing in the kitchen who could be pointed at. 19 years old. Out of the foster system. No diploma. No family anywhere. 3 weeks in a house she had no business being in, with access to every room and a key of her own. A person, a jury, would look at exactly once and understand completely. Somebody with nobody. That was what the man in the good coat had said to Corinne Pelletier. And it had not been a description of a target. It had been a job requirement. She had not been chosen because she was clever. She had been chosen because she was the one person in that house nobody on earth would believe. She went home and put supper on and got through it. And afterward, when Odette had gone and the kitchen was quiet, she asked him a question that she meant as almost nothing, just the loose end that had been hanging since the beginning. She asked why he had never asked her, that first night, how a girl who had been in his house 3 weeks came to be reading the contents of his desk in the middle of the night, and Rafe Ferraro, who had never explained himself to another living person, told her the truth. "Because I already knew," he said. "I knew the first week." She did not move. "The agency sent me a girl in June and another in August, and the placement dates were wrong. Not much. Enough." He turned his glass a quarter turn on the wood, the way he did. "By the time you'd been here 5 days, I knew somebody had been paid to put you in this house. What I didn't know was what you'd been paid to do. So I kept you where I could see you, and I waited to find out. You kept me." "I kept you," he said. She said, "The room." And he did not look away from her, which she would think about later, because it would have been easier for him to look away. "Top floor," he said. "One staircase, no back stairs, no second landing, no way down that doesn't come past my door." He said it evenly, without softening any part of it. "If you went down at night, I would hear you." June stood there in that kitchen for a long time. She thought about the warmth of a key out of a man's shirt pocket in her palm. She thought about standing at that window with the river going brown and slow in the last of the light, and her voice gone somewhere she could not follow it, and about how she had sat down on the edge of that bed and put both hands flat on the blanket and breathed, for the first time in 4 years, because a man had given her a door that locked from the inside and told her he did not keep a copy. She had built something on that. She had built more on that than on anything else in her life. So the bolt was never to keep people out, she said. It was to keep me where you could hear me. Yes, one word, and he did not decorate it, and he did not reach for her, and he did not say the thing that a smaller man would have said about how it was different now. He let it be exactly as bad as it was. And then he said the only other thing he said that night. I gave you that key for 2 reasons. There's only one of them left. She went up the 2 flights, and then the narrow stairs. And she stood in the doorway of that room a while before she went in, and she looked at the bolt, and she understood that she was going to have to leave this house, that there was no version of the rest of her life that started from inside it, and that she was not going to do it until after the hearing, because the hearing was not about her. The courtroom in the Orleans Parish Civil District building smelled like floor wax and old paper, and the particular cold that stone holds in the fall, and it was smaller than June had pictured, a working room with a bench and 2 tables, and 3 rows of chairs along the wall. Curtis Bramwell was already seated when they came in a camel coat he did not take off, a heavy man in his 50s with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into something comfortable and patient. He looked at Rafe, then he looked at June, and his expression did not change at all, but something behind it recalculated, and she met it and held it, and did not look away first, and then she sat down and opened her folder. Preston Gale opened for Meridian, and he was very good. He was organized, unhurried, and he spent the first 10 minutes not on the note at all but on the family, and he used the word girl 3 times about June, each time gently, each time as a small kindness he was extending to her, and each time it landed exactly as intended. And then he did the thing Miriam had warned them he would do, and he did it without raising his voice. He put in front of the court the matter of a certain local news outlet, which had published a piece concerning this witness in the fall, and which had, within 11 days, lost 3 national advertisers, had its lease called, and ceased operations entirely, leaving 12 people without work. He did not accuse anyone of anything. He did not have to. He simply asked the court to keep in mind, when weighing the credibility of the defense, the sort of thing that tended to happen to people who wrote inconvenient words about this particular family. June sat with her hands flat on the table and did not look at Rafe, and Rafe did not move at all, and she thought about a folded printout in a shirt pocket, and a man standing out in the yard past dark, and there was no satisfaction in it anywhere. Then Miriam called her. June walked to the stand with her folder, and sat down, and turned her chair very slightly, so that she was facing the bench, and not the room, and she took the court through it the way she had taken Rafe through it at a kitchen table, slowly, in ordinary words, with no terminology anywhere in it. What the agreement said the interest would do, what the ledgers showed it had actually done, where the 2 lines separated, and what the separation came to across all those years. She did not perform any of it. She had never in her life had to perform competence, only hide it. Partway through, Judge Adele Kimbrough took a legal pad and a pencil, and worked the multiplication herself, twice, and set the pencil down, and said nothing. Gale stood for cross with a single sheet of paper he never looked at. Miss Merritt, you left school in the 11th grade. Yes, sir. You have no training in accounting, no certificate, no license of any kind. That's correct. You are, at present, employed as a domestic in the household of the defendant. You live in his home. He pays your wages. Yes. Then on what authority do you sit in this courtroom and tell a judge that my client has committed fraud? And June, who had spent 4 years being spoken to in that exact tone by people with far less reason, took her time answering. I'm not telling her that, sir, she said. The numbers are. My schooling doesn't change what a multiplication comes out to. If it did, the whole thing would fall apart for everybody, not just for me. She put her hand flat on the folder. If you'd like, I'll work it out on the board in front of the room, and you can follow every step, and so can the court, and so can Mr. Bramwell. It takes about 4 minutes. Gale opened his mouth, and Judge Kimbrough, who had not looked up from her pad, said, She's right about that, Mr. Gale, and made another note, and the room was very quiet, and Gale asked 2 more questions that went nowhere at all, and then sat down. Corinne Pelletier testified after the recess, and she did it without one soft word for herself. She said what she had been offered and what she had done for it, and when Gail asked her whether she understood she was admitting to conduct that could end her license, she said yes, sir, and did not add anything to it. And when she was asked what she had been told the requirement was, she repeated the sentence exactly. Somebody with nobody. And the room took that the way a room takes a thing it will remember. And then the door at the back opened, and Marlene Ruddick came in. Nobody had subpoenaed her. Nobody had spoken to her since a stairwell in Mid-City. She stood at the back, a moment in a coat she had clearly bought for this, and then she walked up the aisle and said, to no one in particular, and to the whole room, that she had been the fifth one, and she would like to say so out loud. Miriam put her on the stand. She testified for 11 minutes. She named the amount, and the man in the good coat, and the month, and she did not look at June once until the very end, and then she did, and held it. And June looked back at her, and nothing passed between them that anybody else in that room could have named. Miriam put in the maintenance file after that, the 3 inspection reports, and the 3 capital requests, and the 3 denials, and the clause that gave the note holder the pen, and the signature cards side by side with the R that closed at the top on one and did not on all the others. And Judge Kimbrough looked at those 2 cards for a long time under her glasses. Then Miriam said she had no further witnesses. And Rafe Ferraro stood up. Miriam turned and said his name, once, low, and he did not sit down. He asked the court's leave to testify on his own behalf. And Kimbrough looked at him over her glasses and said that was his right, and she would hear him. He took the stand in a courtroom full of people, half of whom had grown up in that city hearing his family's name spoken the way you speak of weather that has already killed somebody, and he did not defend 1 inch of it. He said what his grandfather had done at the wharves in the 50s, and named the practice plainly. He said what his father had done with the Union in the 70s, and how it was done, and who had been hurt by it. He said that in the first 5 years after his father died, he had run the business the way it had been handed to him, and that he had made men afraid on purpose, because fear was cheaper than lawyers, and that he had told himself it was not the same thing as violence, and that he no longer believed his own argument. He did not soften any of it. He did not say he had changed. He gave the court the record, all of it, the way a man empties his pockets on a table. And June, sitting in the second row with her hands in her lap, understood that she was watching the cruelest thing this man had ever done in his life, and that he was doing it to himself, and that it was the only thing left in the world he had not yet been willing to spend. Then he said, Your Honor, Mr. Bramwell is right about most of what he has said concerning my family. I'm not here to prove that we're clean. I'm here because my brother died on a section of deck that 3 separate inspectors said needed replacing, and 3 separate times the money to replace it was refused by the man who held our paper, and his name was signed where mine should have been. He set his hands on the rail. If this court wants to hold my name against me, I'm sitting right here and I'll take it. But I'd ask that it not be used as a reason to stop short of the question of who signed those 3 refusals. Gale rose for cross and stood there. And whatever he had prepared for a man who was going to deny things had no purchase at all on a man who had just said all of it first. And after a moment he said he had nothing further, and sat down. Curtis Bramwell, in his camel coat, turned and said something quietly to his attorney. And it was the first time all day that he had been the one to speak first, and everyone in that room saw it. The family court filing sat in its own folder in Miriam's briefcase all through those 2 days, a separate matter on a separate docket, and the exhibit that came to matter most in it was a piece of manila paper from a 2nd-grade classroom on Camp Street. Poppy had drawn her family in October, the way children are asked to every October. There was her uncle, very tall, in a white shirt. There was Odette, with a spoon the size of an oar. There was Toby with something in his hand that was probably a wrench, and might have been a fish. There was a barge with 9 boxes on it, all 9 this time, and a tugboat with a face. And standing next to the girl in the middle, holding her hand, was a person in a gray dress, with her hair tied back behind her neck. The teacher had written the children's answers on the back, the way teachers do. Beside that last figure, in a teacher's round hand, was the question, "Who is this?" And beneath it, in the same hand, the answer as the child had given it. My friend. Loretta Sable looked at that drawing for a long time in a conference room off the corridor with the door shut, longer than anyone expected, holding it with both hands the way you hold a photograph. She was 63, and she had buried a daughter and a son-in-law, and she had spent 4 years unable to make herself walk through a certain front gate, and she looked at 9 barges and a tugboat with a face, and a house full of people her granddaughter had drawn without being asked to include any of them. And then Miriam told her the rest, quietly and without any pressure in it, where the retainer for Vance and Groves had come from, and whose money it was, and what that same money had done to a section of deck 4 years ago. And Loretta Sable set the drawing down on the table and put her hand over her mouth and did not say anything for a while. She withdrew the petition herself the next morning. Nobody asked her to. Nobody argued with her. She signed the withdrawal in the corridor with a borrowed pen, and then she said, to Rafe, without softening it, that she still could not stand that house, and that she was going to want Sundays, and Rafe said she could have Sundays and anything else she asked for, and that was the whole of the negotiation. When Judge Kimbrough took the family matter up for the record, she closed the folder on the bench and said one thing before she moved on. I've read the school reports, and the medical records, and the home study in this file, she said. That child is up to date on everything she should be up to date on. She has 4 sketchbooks full, and she sleeps through the night. I have no interest whatsoever in the surname on her birth certificate. I'm interested in who in that house gets up first in the morning on her account. Then she ruled on the note. She found the interest had been compounded in a manner the instrument did not permit, and had been applied that way knowingly and consistently across multiple agreements over a period of years. And she voided the note in full, and she found that the Ferraro property retained clear title to the deep water berth. She found the pattern of acquisition along that stretch of river sufficient to warrant referral, and she referred the maintenance denials, the signature cards, the placement records, and the whole of the acquisition documentation to the Attorney General's office of the state of Louisiana for criminal investigation. And then she looked over her glasses at the man in the camel coat and said that in her opinion he would want counsel he trusted for what came next. And Curtis Bramwell's face did not move at all. She gave her notice on a Friday, and Odette did not argue with her, which was how June knew Odette had understood everything without ever being told any of it. Miriam Vaughn offered her a position as a financial investigations assistant, entry level, with the firm covering tuition for evening classes at the university. And June said yes before the sentence was finished. And then she found a 1-bedroom in a plain building near Bayou St. John, with a window that faced nothing, and a lease with her own name at the top. And she signed it herself, and she moved her canvas bag and her notebook and her mother's brass key into it on a Sunday. She left the Ferraro house because she had to. Not out of anger, because a girl who has just learned that the first kind thing anybody ever gave her had 2 reasons behind it, cannot build a life on the second one until she is standing on ground she paid for herself. In the spring, on a Sunday, there was an extra chair at the table on Prytania Street, and Loretta Sable sat in it for the first time in 4 years and stayed the whole afternoon, and Poppy spread 11 drawings across the tablecloth and made her grandmother look at every single one. And there was gumbo, and there was arguing about the saints, and somebody's dog got into the yard, and Odette said afterward that the house had finally stopped sounding like a hallway. Corinne Pelletier's boy had his transplant that February, and it took, and he went back to school in the fall. Curtis Bramwell's matter went to the Attorney General, and then it went on for a long time, the way those things do, and 4 families along that river got their berths back. Rafe came to her door in the fall with a can of chicory coffee in his hand, 9 months after she had walked out of his house, and he did not come in until she asked him to. He said, I waited until you didn't need $1 from me, because I needed the answer to come from somebody who could say no and lose nothing at all. You can say no now, so I'm asking. June went and got her mother's brass key out of the drawer, the one that had opened a door in a building that no longer existed, and she set it down on the table between them and left it there. Then she took a copy of her own apartment key off the ring and put it in his hand. I don't need anybody to give me a door anymore, she said. I've got my own, but I'd like you to have the key to it. Outside, somewhere past the rooftops, a barge sounded its horn on the river, long and low, the way it had every night of her life in that city. For 4 years, nobody in those office buildings had ever remembered her face. She had believed that was the worst thing that could happen to a person. It was not. The worst thing is not being unseen. The worst thing is believing them when they tell you there was never anything worth looking at. A uniform does not decide who you are. Neither does a name on a birth certificate, or a file, or an estimated date somebody guessed at, because there was a box that had to be filled. What decides it is what you do when nobody is watching you do it. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today, because that is what lets us keep bringing you stories like this one. And we would truly love to know how this one landed for you. Which moment stayed with you the longest? Tell us in the comments, honestly, from the heart, because we read them and they mean a great deal to us. Until then, we wish you good health, peace in your home, and quiet joy in your ordinary days. Take care of yourself, and we will see you in the next video.